Hello, and welcome to Flipping the Table. In this second episode of Season 6, Michael speaks with Native American rancher Kelsey Ducheneaux-Scott, who represents the 125th generation of land stewards from the Cheyenne River Sioux Nation in South Dakota. Kelsey is only 30 years old, but carries the combined knowledge of her ancestors and her science-based education. As you will hear, she reflects a powerful combination that supports our belief at Flipping the Table that we can solve the many challenges before us by working together to combine the best of the old with the best of the new. Enjoy the show.
Last fall, I watched a fabulous film called The Revolution Generation. It is a documentary all about the millennials that were born between 1981 and 1996. The psyches of this generation have been shaped by the tragedy of 9/11, the 2007-9 financial crisis, mass shootings in schools, crushing college debt, and hurricanes Katrina and Sandy, which ushered in the era of climate chaos. They know society-wide dangers. They have felt fear about events way outside their control or that of their families. Unlike the tropes that often label them as screen-addicted, lazy, and self-involved, the film makes clear millennials are a generation focused on taking action to address the many challenges before us. I have met and worked with many millennials over the years, and they give me hope. I highly recommend the film Revolution Generation to lift your spirits, and it's available on Amazon. And by the way, it was produced and directed by Josh and Rebecca Tickell, the husband and wife team that made the film Common Ground, about which you will hear a bit toward the end of my conversation, with a living example of a proactive and future-focused millennial, Kelsey Ducheneaux-Scott. Kelsey is a fourth-generation tribal rancher living within the Cheyenne River Sioux Nation. But as she sees it, she is actually the 125th generation of land stewards with a mutually beneficial relationship to the animals she raises. Beyond that, she has a very large number of leadership positions, including as chief strategist for the Intertribal Agriculture Council, a national nonprofit that promotes the use of Indian lands for the benefit of Indian peoples. Our wide-ranging conversation today explores Indigenous knowledge, the need to perceive clearly what the future holds, and what it is like to star in a documentary film about regenerative agriculture. I know you will feel as I do that Kelsey is an inspiration and a shining example of how we can combine ancestral knowledge with new science to fix the world. Let's begin. Kelsey Scott, welcome to Flipping the Table. Really nice to be in contact with you as you are out in South Dakota right now. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Sure. So today we're gonna talk all about your life and your work, your important life and work. And I think we should always begin with your origin story. How did you come to be doing what you're doing?
Yeah, I think my origin story, I didn't realize it at the time, but it goes way back to when I was about 4 years old, and the house that I'm sitting in was being built. And in order to do that, we have a unique soil type where we don't always have full basements in our homes, but we have crawl spaces. And so they were excavating the soil to build the crawl space, and they had deposited this big mound of soil just off to the west of our house here. And when we moved in, that was my immediate playground. I was out there playing on the soil pile, and I had so much fun out there. And then I started going to school that fall, and I'll be darned if I didn't return on the school bus one day and my soil pile was gone. And I was heartbroken. I was shattered. I didn't know where I was going to play, but I attribute my origin to having the luxury of getting to grow up in the middle of nowhere, where when it rains, you just don't go anywhere because you can't get there. The roads aren't good enough. When it blizzards, you also don't go anywhere except for to check the cows. And being immersed in nature, I think, is what started me early on in my life down the path to wanting to know more about my relationship with nature and all that it has to offer.
That's a very cool story. I really appreciate that. And I know it is interesting how those really young events, really young experiences can shape a lot of things. And it's a wonderful story. And you do live in a very amazing place, South Dakota, the Great Plains, where a lot of the history of the United States around bison and cattle was unfolding. And so, when people hear in the introduction what your life is about, all the different things you're doing, it's pretty amazing. You are truly a leader for someone as young as you are. So why don't you just talk about the different things that you're doing, both with the tribe and outside the tribe and in the world of agriculture?
Well, I appreciate the explanation of me being as young as I am. I'm celebrating year 30. And so it's a unique milestone in which I'm like realizing just how much I've gotten to do, but also all the things that I hope to be able to accomplish with the unique communities that I get to serve. I'm a tribal producer here on the Cheyenne River Sioux Indian Reservation. My husband and I manage, alongside our family, the DX Ranch. We're a regenerative cow-calf beef operation, as well as have a registered quarter horse herd here on the place. We also have an agritourism branch on the ranch, which is intended to serve as an opportunity for folks to come here and to learn and to be immersed in all it is that we're learning day to day in what we do. Professionally or in my career, I have served the Intertribal Agriculture Council, a national nonprofit organization that got its start on the heels of the farm financial crisis in the 1980s. Uniquely charged to serve Indian producers, Indian country for the benefit of Indian communities. And we have, since our inception, been a response and a appreciation of the resiliency of American Indian farmers and ranchers all across the country. And we're charged now with serving as the largest USDA cooperator in increasing access to USDA programming across the entire department for American Indian land bases. I serve now as the Chief Strategy Officer, which means I get to have a whole lot of fun and understanding where efforts maybe don't necessarily represent or mirror the approach in which our Indigenous ways of being are, but how can we still make a correlation between our Indigenous ways of being and producing and accessing the programming and the offerings that may exist, and maybe better inform those programmings and offerings in the future for everybody's benefit across the country.
Yeah, so it sounds like you have a translation role, taking the knowledge and helping the agencies to understand how it meets their goals.
I think that that's a really great way of explaining it. Might steal it.
Good. So anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just thought that was really
yeah. My time with the IAC has been informed by starting within our youth programming. We're very proud as an organization that a large percentage of our team members, we're now just over 70-person staff, and we have over a dozen of our team members actually got their start in agriculture or food systems work because of interacting with one of our youth programming offerings. And so we really believe that you got to grow your own. You got to invest where you say your mission is. And we're very proud that our growth in our organization has been representative of our belief that we have the change makers and the solutions to decades-long problems right here in our communities in Indian country. And we're glad to be hiring them to help us address where we're heading, having it be informed by where we've come from, and really capitalizing on the potential that we have currently.
Cool. So it was interesting. I thought it was interesting that you separated your ranching life from what you called your professional life. They seem to me to both be professional activities.
I agree. I'm very fortunate in the fact that, just over the weekend, somebody asked me, so what you been doing for fun? And the first thing I was going to say was, we preg checked cows this weekend. And I'm like, well, they might classify that as work. And the second thing that come to mind is all of the cool projects I'm working on at the IAC. And I'm like, man, that's still work. So I have a really hard time identifying either of them really as work because I'm very passionate about what I get to do and the change that both of those efforts within my life are creating, whether that be within my local community, on the land base that I get to help steward, or on the national scope of what Indian agriculture looks like. So I feel very privileged. I joke that my day-to-day producer engagement out there on the land is me making sure I can walk the walk so that in my day-to-day work with the IAC, I'm not just talking the talk.
Yeah. Yeah, good. I think that's really important. And one thing I noted, you talked about the passion that you feel about your work, and it comes through. And we're going to talk about the movie that you're in, Common Ground, later in this conversation. But that really comes out. And one of the reasons I really wanted to meet you when we were in DC for the screening and to do this podcast is because I could really feel it both in the film and in seeing you speak there and talking with you. That passion is really important for inspiring others to pursue similar paths and similar work. So I salute you for that. So obviously you're doing a ton of things that are really pointed toward the future. And one of the things obviously is what you described as regenerative ranching, regenerative production, and the bringing to the fore of Native American agricultural activities. So why don't you just talk about how you would describe this idea of regenerative agriculture?
Absolutely. I think that regenerative agriculture, first and foremost, appreciates that humans are a keystone species within ecosystems. We're not a part of manipulating a system. We're genuinely a part of the system. And we appreciate that our day-to-day activities, our energy exerted, our thoughts that we have a direct correlation with the energies that circulate within the system. And so I really value and appreciate the different ways that conversation is happening and taking place around regenerative agriculture, especially when the humans are at the heart of the conversation that's taking place. And we're thinking about, does the way that this system, humans included, is managing itself contribute to healthier communities locally or contribute to a healthier system worldwide? And if not, why is it? Is it a reaction to historical practice? Is it just a part of a misalignment of navigating the management of the system? Really, what is it? And how do humans play a role in informing the continued evolution of that system?
Mm-hmm. It's really about the way humans think, it sounds to me like, the way they perceive and how they think.
I think it's the practice of a mindset. And a part of that mindset is appreciating that sometimes we're wrong. And we have to constantly be trying to inform our understanding and learning from our surroundings.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the linkage to Indigenous knowledge and the Indigenous practices that are really becoming more and more the focus of agencies. I know here in California, the state is turning to tribes to help us manage our fire risk, the better management of wildlands. So how do you see when you think about your relationship and your linkage to the tribe and the ancestors, where do you see that knowledge being applied on the ranch?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the knowledge is most applied on the ranch in our intentional practice of not pointing out problems, but trying to understand why a certain thing is surfacing and appreciating that it's a response within the system. Constantly being curious and inquisitive around the system's reaction and understanding what happened before and what implications might that have moving forward. One, so that we can try to prepare and adjust, but two, so that we can learn and we can try to become more in tune stewards of the system that we get to participate in. I really appreciate the fact that the parts of the film that I got to be included in introduced me as of the 125th generation to get to steward this landscape. And I stole that phrase from my father. I probably should have added a generation on there. But I think that that's the reality is I'm not just fourth generation raising the fifth on this ranch. there were many, many generations producing on this land base prior to the existence of even the Ducheneaux name here in this area. And so I think that we have to really respect and appreciate that we're not just managing a system that's in this particular classification because that's what great grandpa did. We're managing a millennial long system now, and we're participating in its evolution through multiple phases of a world food system. And we have to really inquire about what that means where we're currently at in navigating production systems from one year to the next. But what does it mean for my son when it's his turn to get to participate in managing this land base, and how am I shifting my approach to better benefit his ability to manage it long term? And so, yeah, I think it's for as far as that Indigenous framing of mind for how we produce here, it's just in constantly inquiring, being inquisitive, trying to understand how it all interplays. And one practice is to never identify a problem, but to identify what created that reaction within the system.
So it's like a really good doctor viewing the human body and trying to understand why the body has a rash or has a tumor or whatever. It's trying to figure out what is underneath. And so you're looking at the land and the soil. So let's get very concrete about, let's say, grass. Like what's happening for you? What are you all doing on the land that's related to the kinds of grasses or the amount of grass, so that people can see how the framework that you describe is applied and results in a concrete thing on ground?
Yeah, absolutely. We're at a really unique place just coming off of a pretty severe drought in the past year, which has been a multi-year one. And so we have seen really unique trends in our grass within the past 10 years that when you look at just the past three, right, it are a different representation. And so some of the things that we're recognizing in our day-to-day management is timing in which our grasses are going to seed is shifting along with some of the seasonality that's taking place. And so we need to be aware of that so that we can shift our grazing dates to continue to contribute to the establishment of the native plant species or reestablishment of those native plant species within our seed bank. So that might look like a different timing within which we're grazing a certain paddock or a certain area of our ranch. It might shift to a different type of animal that's being exposed from one season to the next, recognizing that the two animals we predominantly have in our livestock base are horses or cattle, right? But there's also wildlife that inhabit areas within our land too. And so we need to be shifting our grazing patterns in a way that appreciate and recognize when our ungulate species or other grazing animals are going to be inhabiting certain land bases, because it has a direct correlation with our species biodiversity that we're aiming to accomplish.
We hope you're enjoying the conversation. If you are, please rate our podcast and offer a review. Your voice will help us grow our listener base, which helps us sustain the funding to share these conversations with the people and organizations shaping a more just and regenerative future. A future in which the food and farm businesses are helping to solve the largest challenges of our time.
So we haven't talked about bison at all. I know that I've been looking at some of the information that's been flowing about the reestablishment of bison herds in different lands that are tribally held, sovereign lands that are being managed by tribes across the country. What's your sense of that? How do you feel about that going on? Do you see that in your future? Obviously, South Dakota was a place where there were lots of bison at one point. What's that create in your mind when you think about that?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to practice that approach that we just talked about, where I'm going to get curious and inquisitive. And when I do that, as it relates to bison, what comes to mind for me, or at least the depth of my knowledge around it that I've acquired so far in my reflection, because I do spend a lot of time reflecting on this, is the fact that bison were the large species that we were the first herdsmen and women of here on this continent. And our relationship with the bison was because we knew its ability to have an impact within this system. And so we, as a keystone species of this system, helped to shift and manipulate our relationship with the bison to have a positive impact on the productivity and the ecosystem function that was taking place. And we do our best to practice that type of relationship, that herdsmanship, that stewardship within our management of our cattle system here. As far as if bison are going to be in our future, maybe my sons or my grandchildren's, but probably not in my immediate future, largely due to a couple of things. One being the amount of physical infrastructure that we would have to invest in order to maintain our herd here. Bison are a very nomadic species, just like our people were. And so we have to appreciate the stress and the unintended harm that can be created within a bison population when you eliminate their ability to be as nomadic as they were as far as Canada to Kansas, Minnesota to Wyoming. They would be centrally located right here through the blizzards, through the drought, through everything. And given their animal size, their consumption rate, their nature within how they graze, we would have to first navigate an interesting learning curve because I'm not as familiar with all of that, but recognize that we would be working from a population that has very uniquely been shifted across the course of a couple of generations as well. And so there's a lot to be learned there, I think, which I don't think we'll be able to get all of that learning done in order to accomplish that shift within my generation. Like I said, maybe my sons or grandchildren's. The other thing,
there aren't that many animals either. I mean, you need a lot of animals.
That's the other thing is, and I think that there's a lot that could be done on the front of stewarding. I mean, you read some of the early accounts of Native peoples interacting with bison that settlers document in the journals, or even in some of our ancestral teachings. We genuinely were herdsmen and women with those animals. They were not always a large untamed beast. There's accountings of castration taking place within bison herds. Like, we were geneticists. We knew which genes we wanted repropagating within that system, and we were influencing it in that way. And those tame, really human interactive animals are going to be the ones that were first, decimated in some of the species
annihilation,
yeah, that took place early on in the United States version of this history. And so I think that, there's a lot of work to be done in reinvigorating the bison gene pool to be able to reestablish the relationship. That species too has a lot of generational trauma to have to overcome. There's been a lot of generations within the bison population of just trying to refine out the wildest animal, the most untouched animal, as a result of pure survival need that species had. So there's a lot of repair there that I think could be a really unique effort, but you'd have to really have great infrastructure in order to get there. You'd be starting from a large sample size to get down to really refine your genetics to repropagate the land in a way that would allow a 3-wire fence, which is the majority of what we have here on the ranch, to be sufficient in keeping the population centrally located.
Yeah, that's interesting. I appreciate your description of how the population of bison has changed because of what's happened to them, and the idea of a species trauma that makes sense to me. That is very interesting. And what was lost was that domesticity, in a sense, that ability to safely interact with humans or to be cooperative with humans, because the only ones that survived were those who were the most wild and could get away and hide and do what they needed to do to live through the decimation of their species. That's very interesting. One of the things that interests me is I read a book recently regarding bison and the fact that the Dakotas, at one point, born north and south, the USDA put out there was a paper written called the Bison Commons. Are you familiar with that? Where there was a proposal that they would basically pay all the North and South Dakota residents to give up their rights, basically, and create a huge commons that the bison could repopulate. Obviously, that was killed as an idea. There was no way to do it, but it was a fascinating thought because they did some economic analysis and realized it actually might bring more wealth to those two states than they were experiencing at that point.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is lost when it comes to a lot of the large, like closing off areas for ecosystem reimagination or repopulation is that fact that humans were a part of that system. And I think if the commons was able to have been successful in being practiced, that's where my mind goes, is how hands off was that system projected to be? And then would it have failed or succeeded? Because we do know that humans are a keystone species that need to be participatory in the stewardship of bison population and ecosystem remediation, right? So I think that we have to really remember, like with rewilding or these different conversations that are taking place, humans have to be involved in practicing a mindset around regeneration.
Yeah, that's good. It just shows how complex, and it goes back to something you said earlier, which resonates to a conversation I had with a white farmer from here in California who became a real champion of regenerative and organic agriculture, Paul Dolan. And when he described his journey on his farm in Northern California in Mendocino County, I realized he was becoming as sensitive as we project or we understand that Native Americans were around their environment. He was watching everything, and he was looking at the relationships between the birds and the insects and the water cycle and the other four-leggeds that were on the land. And he had completely changed from when he went to school and studied agriculture at Fresno State. I mean, he had gone so much further, and it really was about perception. It was about what he was seeing and letting it tell him things. It's very similar to what you've been describing.
And there's a lot that I continue to pick up and learn and appreciate. You know, there's unique traditions, right, that have like been alleged or like communicated from one generation to the next. And I think many of those traditions have been detached from the actual culture of why that was a tradition, especially within Native communities, with so much of the efforts to divide us from our culture being so recent in our history. An example of this is the gathering of particular birds' feathers for regalia. And I think I'm like that, well, that was a way for us to keep track of bird population. You know, it wasn't simply just the reverence for a particular bird and the demonstration of some sort of superiority level that you had in being able to demonstrate. You know, we tracked species by monitoring these certain things. And I think that we used to be able to probably assess avian species health by managing and monitoring feathers, but we've been distracted or disconnected from that particular teaching that goes along with the tradition of collecting certain feathers. But you know, that happened upon me one random day when I was writing down, keeping my eyes peeled for if there were any feathers around, you know, because I could tell that there was some hunting going on with some hawks in the area. And you just have to be, I think the more we're exposed to nature, the more, you know, those connections still exist in our genes. I really believe that, but you have to be engaged and immersed in enough for your body to be able to reconnect those stories.
Yeah, and it seems underneath all this regenerative movement that's going on, that's kind of what's underneath it all, is reconnecting that knowledge to the conscious mind and to the practices that emerge from how we think about the system. It's really exciting. I'll probably get crucified for this, but in a sense, we have an opportunity to re-indigenize all those people that are managing lands, like to get back to that. Because I'm a European of descent, but at one time, my people were indigenous to pieces of Europe. We all have that somewhere back. And the question is, are we going to wake up to it quickly enough, as you're describing, for us to turn around this degradation that's going on planet-wide?
It's a unique reality that in order to appreciate or practice that awareness, there's a lot of healing. There's generations of healing that we all have to do, you know? And I have this unique opportunity in interacting with producers daily where, you know, there are not very many folks out there that only come from one descendancy of a community, right? We have these like very blended gene pools from which we're trying to navigate right now. And I can't personally practice an appreciation for an Indigenous mindset in my production without also appreciating the part of my gene pool that was on the other side of history, right? And you have to be able to cope and process and heal for not only your generation, but the generations that were participatory in both sides of the history in order to truly, I think, unleash that Indigenous connection again. And that's a hard thing to do. That's a part of where I think that this regeneration movement, it's going to have to be multi-generational before we actually have people that have healed enough of that trauma that has taken place worldwide to actually unleash that Indigenous approach and mindset.
Yeah, well said. I do think that's absolutely true. And I think that I know in my own life, having to deal with the side that was dominating and aggressive. I mean, I have people that go back to Mississippi who enslaved others. When I became aware of that, it started really kind of unearthing what I felt about that. It wasn't just shame and guilt. It was like, how can this happen? And what can I do in my generation to be part of the repair that's needed around that? I wasn't part of it, but we carry it. We carry it. And I realized it was in my body. There was shame in my body. And it's really important right now. And we're in this moment where folks who came here, who were the people that came and conquered the land, so to speak, there's a lot of sensitivity and fear in kind of facing that, I think. It's a real struggle to get people to relax, because it's really about relaxing into it and realizing it's not just me, it's the system. I'm part of something much larger, and I don't have to carry it all. What I have to do is be part of the healing, and that's all that can be asked, really.
Yeah. Yep. And I think one of the unique things that we don't discuss enough is the energy that surrounds the land, and which is a part of the system that we're how this land must have wept when genocide was taking place, or when its connection to the people that had been caring for this land was broken. There's so much trauma, not just in the genes of ourselves and the generations that have stewarded this land as of recent, but just in the land and the microbiome. And there's trauma all around and circulating it. And if we talked more about the trauma in the system, I think it helps to create less polarity around the topic of healing from trauma. It helps us to recognize that there's multiple aspects of trauma that need to be addressed. It's not just the baggage that I'm carrying. There's really been a lot of horrifying ways in which that trauma has been, demonized or almost created a stigma. And if we get back to talking about it as a component of the system, I think we'll be able to accelerate the healing and appreciation and hopefully, return it to just a conversation that is normal and takes place regularly, so that we don't continue to pass it on to the next generation.
Yeah, well said again. I think and I really love this idea of focusing on the land and the healing of the land. The image of what it was like when the sod was being busted up all through the Great Plains. Yeah. Those interactions, those communities of plants, they were disturbed in a very deep way and lost. Luckily, there are little patches of it that are slowly coming back. You were talking earlier about the re-emergence of the native species. That's so important. So this is great. And it gets us right into my next question, which is, when you think 10, 20 years out, you mentioned that you think this is a multi-generational journey that we're on around regeneration, regenerative agriculture, regenerative food systems. What do you see? When you imagine like your best picture of what will be, for your son, who I think is 16 months old, what is he going to experience and see?
I'm hopeful that in the next 10 to 15 years, we're no longer doing fence line comparisons. We're doing fence line appreciations, honoring of fence lines. I think that one of the unique realities that we're faced with in order to try to gain excitement currently around this effort is to say, this is so much better than. But just in that framing, is that really a regenerative approach to suggest something better than, something more superior than, or to try to suggest something more inferior? Like, that's not a healing way of being in my mind. And I'm hopeful that we can kind of change that dynamic of conversation. I understand the need for comparing what can be done within a system with mindset shift, with management efforts that maybe differ from others. But I think that it continues to perpetuate a divide that is going to slow down our transition and our embodiment of the Indigenous way. And I'm hopeful that we're able to reframe our awareness around recognizing that fence lines are merely a model of a made up ownership that our land base is built on now. But that fence line just outside my window does not shift much as it relates to soil class or ecosystem function. There's management changes that happen at that fence line, but from an ecosystem potential standpoint, we have to really start to look beyond fence lines, and we have to honor them differently and respect them differently so that we can all come together and be thinking about our management as groups of stewards rather than me versus them sort of thing.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it's true that the compare and contrast thing is of the moment, and it does perpetuate polarization. And that is unfortunate, because what we need now is rapid change, not people fighting over the details of how it's going to get done or arguing over one way is better than the other. That doesn't get us anywhere. That's stalemate, which we face a lot of in our country today. And it's extremely unfortunate, because the times demand bold, fast action.
And I would agree that bold, fast action in the next 10 to 15 years, another thing I hope to see, it's all aspects of the food system getting participatory so that the bold, fast action can be taken by the land stewards. There's reason that there are fence line comparisons that exist, which are much different than, much deeper than just surface level management choices. There's a financing system, there's a educational component, there's all of these very deep rooted reasons as to why we have comparisons at the fence line that aren't as simple of a fix as I'm just going to make the change because I decided to and I want my land to look like that. We got to fix the financial system. We got to fix the access to resources and technical expertise that our producers have so that they can withstand the change. And there's a lot that goes into that. It's gonna require policy. It's going to require financing. It's going to require philanthropy. The nonprofit organizations, we all, consumers as well. We all have to come to the table and figure out how can we contribute to shifting that framework within which we're talking about regenerative systems and non-regenerative systems in the next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, I think that's true. Very true. I do think that you mentioned policy. I mean, I thought of research. I thought of Common Ground, the film, the linkage between companies that are making money from a certain system and how that impacts policy, and then how that impacts the mindset that we began this conversation with, the mindset that leads to the way we act or manage on the land. All of that is interconnected, and we're talking about a paradigm shift, a shift in the way we think about the world. That doesn't happen that often. When it does happen, it takes a while. One of the things that really interested me when I first got involved in this world was reading about how the adoption of a chemical-based agriculture, an industrial and chemical-based agriculture, really in the post-war period, it took 25 years of people going out and selling a new way. That was a paradigm shift. And so we're now kind of doing that again and repairing the pieces that were unintended consequences from that earlier approach. And you're right, it's going to take a while. And we're just at the beginning in a certain way. Which is at the beginning. In the last segment here of time that we have, I just wanted to begin. This kind of relates to everything you just said. You were a participant, a star, really, in the movie, the documentary that's playing around the country, Common Ground. And you have a really cool section of the film, and I really encourage everybody to see the film. There's you can go to Common Ground on film on Common Ground Movie online, and you will find where it's being shown around the country. We're doing another big event here on February 7th in Sacramento. What was it like to, first of all, have some filmmakers find you and then pay attention and then include you in this incredible story about what's happening on the land?
It's really interesting. I got to spend some time with my family just reflecting this past weekend. And one of the things I was very humbled by is they're going to write about so and so in the history books. Or they're, and to just recognize I get to help to tell the story of the land, of my ancestors, of my passion or my vision, through like modern day forms of documenting history, like podcasts or films. Like, what a privileged existence I have, truly. It was not until actually seeing the film in DC when we both went to that showing that I actually knew to what extent I was featured in the film. I had not seen it prior to that showing, so that was a little nerve-wracking. When they sought out a preliminary call, I had no idea really the scope of which the conversation, where it would go. I had no idea if they were actually going to show up to the ranch and do the interview. I didn't know what to expect as far as, how do you interview for a film like this? Like, what's that process look like? And it was the first of anything of that kind that's taken place on this land, that, to my knowledge, that was quite something. And it was intimidating, to be frank. I didn't know who else they were interviewing along their journey. I didn't know if any comment or statement that I would make, how it would be perceived by the audience or by the film crew. Like, what if what I had to say totally shifted in a bad direction, how the directors would portray tribal production? And so it was a relief for me to see how the film all came together. I think that it was a really great growth in storytelling, for an appreciation, a greater appreciation than anything I've seen, for the fact that Indigenous stewardship practices of managing the landscape that are often pushed to the side or mystified was actually at the heart of the conversation. I think that there's always going to be more growth that needs to take place in uplifting these stories and continuing to tell them in different ways to different audiences. But it was a great step in the right direction. And I was really privileged to be a part of that.
I'm almost over 30 years in this world of trying to fix the food system in certain ways. And I have to say that I had never seen a film that was so nuanced and so balanced about the challenge, that included more traditional agriculture in a positive way and showed how more traditional agriculturalists were engaging this opportunity. It was very nuanced, and it's a complex thing. One of the struggles in this movement to change the food system is that it's complex. And so it's hard to get people to stay engaged with the complexity to understand what the right responses are. It does a really good job of kind of breaking it down and revealing a path forward. And that was uplifting for me. And the fact that issues that you talked about, really, that have to do with race and oppression, were so well folded in and aligned with what's going on the land, but also needs to be going on in the culture. So it was really well done. And your piece was really beautiful. And it's been a real pleasure to talk to you today, to go into more depth about who you are and what you're doing, and to have you share that with our listeners on Flipping the Table. So, Kelsey, I really appreciate your time, and I wish you all the luck in the world, and I hope to see you again in one of these screenings.
Likewise, I really appreciate the opportunity to meet you in person a few months ago, but then to also reconnect. And I look forward to the ways that our paths can continue to cross to keep telling these stories.
Thank you. All right, you take care.
Yeah, you as well.
Thank you for listening. Roots of Change is a program of the Public Health Institute.